All right. Well, the topic of my talk today is classroom discourse analysis with corpus linguistics. And more specifically, I will focus on university classroom talk, discussing it from two major threads. One is a discourse structure perspective, and one is an interaction perspective in university classes. So, for each thread then, I will be presenting the analytical tools that I developed or collaborated with colleagues and developed them together. And then I'm going to present some of the findings that I have encountered the past decade or so, and new ones as well. And they are mainly focusing on lexical-grammatical patterns in these different units of analysis. But I'm also going to maybe able to touch at the end of my talk on some of the lexical patterns as well. We'll see how fast I can go with this. I'm sure that, I'm hoping that I'm not going to run out of time. So these studies will illustrate how we are able to arrive at these varying units of analysis with these different tools, and therefore be able to analyze classroom discourse from the different perspectives again. I will take a little break between the two topics. So when I finish the discourse structure talk part, I'll look at question answers, just a couple of them, and I'll try to just zoom in on the interaction part very briefly, and maybe take questions after that as well. And please shout out if I'm running out of time, because I don't want to do that. So traditionally, classroom discourse studies have been carried out only a few texts at a time, and you know, researchers were looking at the structure of classroom talk or the patterns of interaction between the participants, but it's usually just one or two or three or four texts at a time, and a very detailed analysis of those texts. So in terms of discourse structure studies, for example, researchers have had the goal to describe the way in which the discipline structure information, or how teachers signal change in the discourse. For example, when we teach in our classes, suddenly, you know, the professor says, and the topic of my lecture today is blah, and then starts talking about the different topics that he might be or she might be covering. The interactional studies, the goal there was or is to describe the way in which internal utterance structures are building blocks in a larger intellectual sequence or unit in the discourse. Or the other purpose or goal for these studies have been to look at how participants engage collaboratively in constructing meaning as a social action, okay? Now, the analytical approaches in previous studies were different from what we are doing in corpus linguistics, and I'll illustrate that today. The units of analysis have been identified through functional categories, and as I mentioned, based on close readings of text. So what do I mean by that? And for instance, in the discourse structure studies, the good old model that we have been working with for quite a while now is the initiation, response, feedback, or evaluation sequence. And so, for instance, language classes were looked at for these particular sequences, and then see what patterns emerged in the texts. The markers of change in discourse structure studies were looked at by many through lexical phrases and discourse markers. By the way, I'm not going to mention any references here because there are so many, and I'm sure I'm going to leave somebody out, and I'm sure people are going to get upset. And so instead, I'm just going to talk about these things, but do know that there is a vast amount of literature involved in discussing these areas. So in interactional studies, again, the units are identified ahead of time, just like in the discourse structure studies. They are identified ahead of time, and they are basically functional categories that people define first, and then they look for them in the text, okay? But, you know, at this point in time for interaction, I think there has been, again, lots of literature discussing what actually constitutes a turn is still not debatable, but everybody defines it somehow differently. And so it's really hard to then come to the same set of replicable analyses that people might be able to do. The markers of change in interactional studies would be, for example, when we look at back channels, okay, or when we look at reactive forms or so. All right. Now, there is one big challenge that a corpus linguist faces if he or she wanted to do such analysis, and that is that these are functionally defined categories, and then they are looked for in the text. And it, as I mentioned, it requires a close reading of the text itself. Now, when you have a 1.4 million word corpus, that's rather difficult to, you know, or time consuming and resource consuming, so to speak, to kind of like do those kinds of analysis. So we need to kind of look for a different type of method through which we can automatize at least the identification of the units of analysis. And then we can just go in and analyze those units, whatever those are, whether it's a turn or whether it's some kind of a discourse unit, and then characterize those units linguistically. So the primary goal in discourse studies, I think, in corpus-based studies, is to describe the linguistic variation that we can find within the text and its relationship to the structure of discourse. And so we are doing that using tools that will automatically somehow segment discourses into subunits so we can work with them further in terms of its linguistic variation. And in interactional studies for classroom discourse, it's similar to describe the linguistic variation, grammatical and lexical, but in participant language use and that relationship to participant roles. So that's what we're going to kind of look at today. So very specifically, I'm going to go through the discourse structure studies by first identifying the units of analysis, then doing a lexical grammatical analysis through factor analysis, and see extra-textual features of the text, how they result in, you know, manifesting all these different discourse structure patterns through the linguistic patterns that emerge from the text. And if I have time, I'm going to go into the lexical studies, but I will focus mostly on bundles in turn initial positions as for the interactional studies. So let's get to it. Can you see my slide going? Let me just get that feedback for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's move on. So when I talk about the discourse structure studies, the first topical area, I'm going to use two corpora. The first one, mainly the first one actually, which is 196 class sessions, the T2K corpus, as well as the 𝗏 corpus, some parts of the 𝗏 corpus, comprising about 1.4 million words altogether. But then in the last segment of this topical area, I'm going to also show you some results from the 31 class sessions that were collected or recorded and transcribed in Singapore, which comprise about 500,000 words. So let's get to the first part. So the first part, as I said, is the 196 class sessions recorded 1.4 million words. And this is the distribution, as you see, of the different disciplines. Pretty much the same number of files, except for education. I think I might have to add a few files to that area because it seems to be a little bit underrepresented. If I wanted to slice that in terms of that corpus, in terms of level of instruction, we have low division classes, we have upper division classes and graduate classes. And so we're going to see how discourse structure is different in disciplines and levels of instruction. And then I'm going to zoom in into one particular discipline and see how variation is similar or different in in the two different geographical contexts. But as I mentioned, the first thing we have to do is somehow segment discourse into subunits, so we can talk about discourse structure in the first place. Not an easy task, but the conceptual background behind it, at least for the work that I've been doing, is Prince's idea that new vocabulary, as it enters into the discourse, brings about new topics. So that's a kind of an interesting idea and probably true. So it would be quite nice to see, to what extent that would then somehow relate to the structure of discourse in a way. So 𝗏𝗏𝗋s was very inspired by this thought, and so the mid-90s, he developed a program called Vocabulary Management Profile, where he was able to actually track the newly occurring vocabulary items in the discourse, and then plotted them into a graph. It's just imagine this as a type token ratio, but it's a sliding type token ratio because it's kind of going through the text as time goes by, okay? Now, Marty Hurst was inspired by 𝗏𝗋𝗋's work and developed a more sophisticated way of thinking about this and called it her program a text styler. I don't want to go into details about how they are different. They're a little bit different, but Marty Hurst is a hardcore computational scientist, so she really played with the idea and kind of tested the different ways this could work. And then finally, my colleagues and I, taking these two main programs, and the concepts behind them, and we developed a so-called vocabulary-based discourse unit program. And so this particular program, what it does is, and I'm going to show this to you how this works, so don't worry about it. It's not just going to be text, okay? It's just 1 second, but I need to frame it a little bit. So there are 2 steps involved in this. In the first step, we want to compare, the vocabulary in 2 blocks of a window that at each word, okay? And I'll show you how this works in a minute. And then we want to be able, and then we can plot that. And then we want to be able to identify where the boundaries are. So where is it that we can say this is a chunk or a unit, and this is a unit, and this is a unit. But let's go to the very first step at a time. So what I'm talking about is that here's this window of text, and it has block 1 and it has block 2, as you see. Now, if you look at it closer, you will see that what words, let's pretend that these are words, and it's a 50-word window, a 50-word block compared to a 50-word block in the program, but I can't really put that on the screen and kind of like have it nicely laid out. So I'm just going to play with this just to show you how this works. So we're comparing what's in block 1 with block 2 and give it a similarity value, okay? So in this case, block 1 has these 7 types of words and block 2 has the same type of word. So what would be the similarity value? Well, of course, there's 100% overlap. So because it's exactly the same as if you were just copying, whatever is in block 1 into block 2. So the similarity measure will be 100% overlap. It's going to be 1, okay? Now, what happens if it's a completely different set? Okay, so in block 1, we have 7 different types of words, and in block 2, it's another set of words. Of course, the similarity measure is 0 because there's no overlap whatsoever. So we're assuming that since these 2 blocks are not similar at all, they are lexically coherent units, but they are talking about different things, okay? So let me move on and see what happens if, it's kind of like an in-between scenario where some words are the same, like ACD, ACD, A again. So some words are different, but some words are not. And then the similarity measure will be, again, neither 1 or 0, but in between somewhere, these 1 and 0, or 0 and 1. There's a beautiful, a beautiful calculation here that through which you can then come up with this similarity measure. And I can talk about this, you know, after the presentation if you want what this means. Or you can actually look at yourself a book called Discourse on the Move, and on page 161 you'll find exactly the same formula to calculate these. But the point here is that as the text is sliding through this window, right, at each word we're calculating a similarity measure. And let me show you what that means. So for example, here we have 3 words, 3 types of words that are similar. So the similarity value is 0.42 or 43 almost. So the word moves out of the window and the block becomes different because a new word comes in. And now in this case, it looks like the 2 blocks are less similar, right? Because it's only 2 words, let's say, that are the same. So the similarity measure will be less because there's less of an overlap. All right, so if we wanted to kind of see this as a graph, which we could do, and it's going to be pretty, I promise. The similarity value will be between 0 and 1 at all times. That's, again, 0 overlap or 100% overlap, let's say. And so I would say 150th word has an 0.1 similarity measure, 151st word 0.2, 153rd word 0.3. And so I can just plot it every single word as we go along, you know, and it just kind of comes up very nicely. It's a beautiful little graph that you can then see how this dynamic change of old and new vocabulary comes into the discourse through, as we run through the text itself, or through time, I would say. This is a real example. We have been playing so far, but this is a real example now where it's the first 500 words of a text, as you see at the bottom here. And this is the plotted graph for that 500 words in terms of entering old and new vocabulary items as you're comparing those 50 blocks within that window that we show. Now this is all very well, right? But still we haven't segmented this yet. So how do I know where a new topic really is starting? Because here it's only telling me, let's say, right, in the around the 300 word level, it's only telling me that, yeah, there is some change, but is it robust enough that it's a new, somehow it's a new area or a new topic or a new lexis that's coming in so robustly compared to this other one, which is a huge difference, right? It's after the 380th word or so, there's you could see it's a very nice change, and you could mark that as a unit itself. Well, since we have the similarity values for the peaks as well as for the valleys here, then we could just have to come up with some sort of a mechanism through which we can be confident that where we cut the units. So this particular program, I mean, I worked on this myself for my PhD actually, to determine what these values would be. And for this particular register, it seemed that if there is a difference, a 25% difference between a peak value, similarity value, and a valley value, that would be reasonably, you know, making a change, okay? But I also had to determine that for this register, once again, that the similarity value of 0.3 would help me to determine the real units rather than, you know, just kind of some pseudo units like this one would be. I don't know whether you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? So I'm just kind of showing this, but yeah, maybe.
Yep.
Okay, good. So, you know, this one would not qualify right here, for example, as a new unit because just it's by itself, because, you know, it's just not big enough, and the similarity value does not go below 0.3. But nonetheless, the way this is calculated was that, you know, identify the peaks and then identify the valleys based on this formula that you see on top, 25% difference plus similarity value. Once again, these values could be changed. So, you know, let's say for other types of other registers, it might be different. With spoken discourse is a little tricky, you know. But 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Jim Jones and 𝗬𝗏𝗂𝗏 had carried out a study, which is also in the Discourse on the 𝗏𝗏 book, whereby they looked at written discourse, whereby there's very clear demarcation of where the segments are, and that those are paragraphs, right? Number one, those are sections in articles, let's say, or book chapters. So they applied this very same methodology, and, you know, with a high accuracy, they were able to find where those demarcations were in the written text. For spoken discourse, it's a little trickier, and I must say that conversation is even noisier than university classroom discourse. But let's get back to the point here. So we are identifying now the valleys and the peaks, and so we are able to actually segment discourse into different units. So, like in this case, with those measures, these 4 different units occur. Very well. Then let's move on. Let me just show you a little text extract, how this works actually, or how it's actually manifesting itself. In the first segment, you know, the black words are the ones that are overlapping with the second segment, okay? And the colored words are the one that don't appear in the other segment. So as you see, this is completely different, and I'll let you kind of look at the recording again to actually read the text and see that, yes, there is a difference between what is talked about on the top and what is talked about at the bottom. And so the program suggests a boundary, you know, before this and after this, but in between, and that's what I wanted to illustrate, that the program suggests the boundary right here, saying that there are very different words in these 2 segments, and therefore it must be something is talked about in a different way in these 2 segments, okay? Okay, so what do we do? So we have these 196 classroom discourse, the classroom discourse files, and we segment them into these units that I just showed you, and we arrive at 5,829 units. I have to say that this is just another slicing of the pie. Once again, for level, I have to say that only those units that are 100 words or more got into further analysis, the grammatical analysis and the factor analysis, because you know, if it's less than 100 units, I don't want to go into it again, but I'll be happy to discuss it with you separately, why that's problematic if it's less. So it just gives us skewed results. Anyhow, the goal with this study then to explore the text internal variation, linguistic variation, and the relationship between text types then and communicative and instructional purposes. So that's how we can just kind of describe it. But again, the methodology is different because we are not predefining what those communicative and instructional purposes are and then look for them in the text, but it's going to be done through the emerging linguistic patterns that we see in the text. Okay, there are 3 steps. Oops. Grammatical tags are important, so we can do the factor analysis. And we then do the factor analysis and through the co-occurring patterns. Actually, there were 41 lexical and interactional features that ended up on the interpretations of those co-occurring patterns, which would be the dimensions of linguistic variation. So let's see how that works. I'm not sure whether everybody knows 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's grammatical tagger, but there are all kinds of taggers out there. I use this one because it proved to be very reliable and very you know, it gives you a lot of information. So, so it's a very nice tagger. And I heard 𝗬𝗓𝗏 𝗥𝗲𝗍 said that it might be available soon to the public, and you need to contact him about that. But I'm really excited about that, actually. So as you see, the tagger actually identifies the speaker as well. Like speaker 1 is a teacher, and speaker 2 would be a student, let's say. And then it just kind of adds in 6 fields of tags different information about that particular word. This is nice to have, because then what we do, and I'm again not going into details about the factor analysis, but what you do is that you throw all these features into a big pot, and the factor analysis groups them together, and based on their frequencies and based on, you know, how you're iterating them, and you could come up with these different dimensions or factors first, and then interpret them as dimensions for your study. So when I interpreted them, it looked like each dimension has 2 poles, right? The positive and the negative pole, and features that occur on the positive pole will not really co-occur with the ones that are on the negative pole. They don't like each other, okay, that much. But what does it look like when you do it in a text? So the dimension 1 positive, for example, it was first, second person pronouns were very frequent on that factor loading. Modals, contractions, and adverbial subordinators of condition, non-past tense, activity verbs. And as you see in the text that I put here, it really is the case that it's very strongly, they are apparent, whereas the other types of features are less so apparent. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, which I called conceptual informational focus, we have attributive adjectives, and, you know, words, rare words only used in one class session, nouns, nominalizations. It sounds almost like a piece of written discourse or somebody's reading out a text. It's very informationally heavy because of all these features co-occurring together. But that's a conceptual informational focus. Good. Positive dimension 2 is a personalized framing, where it's full of factual verbs and likelihood verbs and mental verbs and third person pronouns and things like, you know, I mean, you know. So the text extract here shows exactly that. When you don't believe that he did that? No, I mean, I don't really want to take it as a, I don't know. I mean, I take it for what it is, which is the further mythologizing of the great Thomas Edison as one of the great men and the great, I don't know. I mean, so he's really kind of, the student is really thinking it through what he wants to say, but in the meantime, there's a lot of hesitation there and a lot of framing devices that would help him get through this processing of his own or her own thought. On the negative side of dimension 2, we see just a simple lack of these features. So there are no other features grouping on the negative side, but the texts themselves would not show any of these features or very few of these features when we talk about lack of personalized framing. So there's no kind of processing. The third dimension on the positive side is interactive dialogue. And so here, some of the interactional features grouped together, which is turns, number of turns, turn length, one word turns. Once again, that was particularly very robust in there, and discourse particles. So as you see the example, there are lots of turns. They're underlined here. Lots of turns in this segment, in this unit. It seems to be there's lots of turns, and there are lots of one word turns, like the teacher says, right, or the student says, yeah, yeah, yeah. Very short turns, right? Well, yeah, yeah. It's kind of an interesting dialogue, but anyhow, so there's some negotiation going on here, but you see that, you know, it's not just linguistic features that could group together, but some of these interactive features as well. And so the negative side of dimension 3 would be when there is a lack of interactive dialogue, which means it's a monologic discourse, basically, in that particular unit, let's say. So getting back to our discourse units then, for each unit then, each unit will have a score a dimension score for dimension 1, dimension 2, dimension 3, as you see. Dimension 1, dimension 2, dimension 3. So for example, if I look at the third unit in a geology class that's 309 words long, I see that it's not very contextually oriented, but it's also not very informationally oriented. It's somewhere in between. So there's a bunch of mixed features in that unit. It is not, there's no personalized framing features too much, and it is a little bit dialogic. There's a little interaction perhaps. However, if I look at unit 4 in the same, so the next segment in the same class, it's a little bit shorter, but it's very heavily informationally oriented, hence the negative dimension score. It has 0 almost, and no personalized features, lack of personalized features, hence a minus 4.9, that's quite a high number. And for dimension 3, that is a negative number, so it tells me that's more monologic than interactive. Okay, that's very good. So what can we do with all of this? Well, if we look at, then we linguistically analyze these units. And our goal is to just kind of like put it back into the discourse so we can see the flow, right? We can see the flow, how it changes in the discourse. So in this case, this data actually is for all the classes in the corpus. It's not one discipline or level or anything, just it's for all the classes. So what we notice here is that, you know, the very first unit that we just identified and segmented would have very many positive features on dimension 1. So it's a very contextually contextual discourse and with a directive orientation, right? Then on dimension 2, there's lack of personalized framing. In fact, that's true for all of these together. And then that it's kind of interactive dialogic, you know, the first unit. Second unit is following the similar pattern, third unit, similar pattern. However, we see that from the fourth unit down, things just change, suddenly change, okay? Now, looking at the text, what happens in the first 3 units, it's associated with classroom management type of discourse. You know, when a teacher comes into the classroom and then, you know, it talks about, okay, who hasn't done the homework, or, you know, how did you spend your weekend? So there's a little chatty part at the very beginning of the classes that is related to classroom management one way or another, either about the class itself or just about, you know, something else. Whereas from the fourth unit down, which turns into a very informationally focused, lack of personal framing, even more so, and maybe it's a little not communicative, but interactive in unit 4, but then it turns into monologic discourse. So I'm assuming that between unit 3 and unit 4, there is that lexical phrase where the teacher says, so here's the topic for today, or here are the topics for today. This is what we're going to do. And then he goes right into it. And it's just showing it through the linguistic change in the discourse structure as we see. Very nice, I think. Okay, so after we have all of this, what we want to see then is how different disciplines might be different in structuring their discourse from these perspectives, right? And we also want to see how maybe levels of instruction would have a different structure as well. So let's look at that. I'm running here. So in terms of discipline, we see that engineering is incredibly context oriented, and I can only show the first 6 units, unfortunately, because, you know, there's no way of showing this and making it nice. So, but believe me, it's true for the first 6 for sure, but even more so. Engineering seems to be very contextually oriented. I imagine that in engineering classing in the States, you know, the teacher is at the blackboard, is either or showing something that is in the context somehow, right? It's either writing on the board, there's no blackboard anymore, but writing on the board, or showing a computer program and just kind of like using language that's very much contextual, like, for example, saying, and so look at what I do here, and then clicks on the mouse, you know, like, can you see here what I'm showing? So it's very contextual. There is no personalized framing whatsoever, and it's dialogic at the first one, but then it turns very fast into just immediate rest, you know, into the topic of the class, perhaps. Natural sciences are a little bit different. They kind of chat around a little bit in contextual first, in the first couple of units, and then go right into the informational type of discourse. No personal framing, nothing. And also dialogically or interactivity wise, it is contextual first, or interactive first, but then it turns into monologic. All right, graduate classes are very much contextual, very much personalized framing, you know, much more, and interactive. Whereas undergraduate classes, again, the first unit is contextually oriented and interactive. And it could remain interactive a little bit. You know, by the way, the different, you know, if the unit is very contextually oriented, it gets 4 or 5 of these plus signs. If it's very informationally oriented, it gets 3. And so there's a degree to which these units are more or less informationally focused or not, or contextually oriented or not. So that just shows by how many of those signs they get. But again, so graduate classes are very different from undergraduate classes, and low division classes in particular, in terms of how the discourse is going about. It might be related to class size. I don't know, because I don't really have information on the class size in the corpus. So I don't know, but that would be interesting to actually see as well. So summary, I think we have been okay. 3 dimensions in the class sessions. You know, the macro structure can be shown by the changing linguistic characteristics. The first 3 units are different from the following units in terms of their linguistic features and profile. The disciplines vary in their discourse structure, very much so actually in the American classrooms. And graduate classes seem to be contextually oriented with personalized framing elements and conducted in a dialogic manner, whereas undergraduate classes have linguistic features that are contextualized first, but the first 3 units, but then after that, no personalized framing occurs whatsoever. And dialogues appear only in a few units. This actually is in a publication that you could read about. Now, but what's interesting now, and it's a new piece of research, is that what happens if I only look at engineering? So for this one, I took 35 files out of the US corpus that were only engineering, and we had 8 files, which is very few, from the Singapore corpus that were engineering, but it's okay because we didn't build up the whole framework, the analytical framework, the multidimensional analysis based on those. So we're just applying, as Tony calls it, the additive multidimensional analysis. We are applying the already existing dimensions that we have just seen to the Singapore corpus and compare it with the university classes just to see whether there's a difference. Okay. So there were 3 different disciplines that we looked at, humanities, natural sciences, and engineering, but I'm only focusing on engineering because that's, that showed the most diversion between the 2 contexts. And this just came out in April in the new journal, Register Studies, edited by 𝗬𝗓𝗏 𝗟𝗏 and Bethany Gray. And it's a wonderful journal, so I encourage everybody to have a look. They have really interesting articles. Okay, so the US corpus is the light blue, right? And the Singapore corpus is the dark blue. As you see, the first 6 units, as we have actually seen before, and this is only the dimension 1 scores. I only have time to discuss that part. So it's only dimension 1 scores, not the 3 dimensions this time. So the US corpus, as you see, is very contextually oriented with a directive orientation, as we have seen already. But the Singapore corpus, the teacher comes in and goes right into the topic. You know, I looked at all these files. It's only 8 files. So after I ran these numbers, it was like, really? Okay, so let me see what's going on here. And so the teacher comes in and starts the class. There's no chatting around. There's no interaction. Starts the class. So this is what's apparent in the first 6 units anyway, which is just approximately maybe 20 minutes into the class, the first 6 units, 20 or so minutes, right? Maybe 25, 20, 25. But at unit 7, as you see, so a little bit more into the classroom, somehow the two contexts converge. And on dimension 1, at least, they both become more contextually oriented. So I wonder what's going on there, and I'm going to have a closer look at that. What's going on there? It's probably that in the Singapore corpus, I did look at a couple of files, the Singapore corpus, the teacher starts the class and then somebody might ask a question. And so there is some elaboration going on here that requires more, a different type of language by the teacher to be used. Maybe it has to be, the concept has to be reformulated in a different type of language that, will help the students understand the concept perhaps. Okay. I think that was an interesting finding, and I would love to see more studies in different contexts to see how that works. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means is that the linguistic features in lectures within one discipline could vary depending on where the lecture is taking place. We have seen that. Natural sciences, humanities did not change much, but engineering did. So what is it about that discipline that will, that makes that contextual difference then? Because the different geographic locations may have different pedagogical practices. That might be the reason, actually. So that was a very interesting finding. I think I'm going to have to skip the text types and see whether anybody has any questions at this point about these. And I could get back to the text types later if I need to, if I can. Okay. So let me look at the, how do I look at the questions? Question answer. Oh, there are a couple. Okay. Eden Flores has, how does the nature of the class course prefigure in the amount of interaction that happens in the class, or how engaging it could be? Well, that's a very good question. I do not know how to measure engagement, to be honest. So that's a good question, and we need to kind of figure out how to measure engagement. That would be very good. Maybe with a clicker. I don't know. That's what they use at San Diego State, but I don't think that that shows engagement, depending on how we define that. And the amount of interaction, well, you know, the class size might have an effect on the amount of interaction, for example, or the teaching style. I mean, my classes are interactive all the time. And I make sure, I mean, you know, the attention span of the kids is like 20 minutes or so. So you got to do something after 20 minutes. I couldn't give a lecture to them like 40 minutes like I did just now, 45, like this, just real text, because they snooze out. So we need to have some kind of interaction built in to the classes. So it's teaching style as well, I would say. What do you think about the use of VBDU combined with the study of stylistic and creative writing? Interesting. I would love to see studies that will go into that, because it would be a very interesting area to explore further. I mean, I use the VBDUs for discourse structure studies mainly, but I also looked at lexical patterns and I looked at lexical bundles in them. And so that was an interesting study as well, but it doesn't relate to stylistics per se or creative writing, but especially creative writing I'm very interested in, because that's a very different genre. So it would be interesting to see what comes out of that. Do you believe that the different tags that exist today are enough to understand more about literature? Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's a simple answer. Okay, in your opinion, what kind of variations within disciplines were more visible in your corpus? Well, this is the only one that I looked at, you see, and I mean, it was really shocking how engineering is so different in these contexts. And so in natural sciences, I didn't see that drastic difference between the two contexts, or in humanities. But I want to see social sciences as well. And I want to collect some more data in other countries as well, because, you know, it could give us some insights about teaching styles pretty much, I think. And so that would be interesting to see. Tony, do I have time a little bit more on the interactive stuff? Do you think? I still have like maybe 10 minutes. I started late. Yeah? Okay, I'll move on then. So with the interactional studies, it's kind of different. The unit of analysis is different. Okay, so let's get our heads out of the VBDUs now. It's not discourse structure. I'm interested in the interaction between the student and the teacher. So again, it's a custom-made program that I used, and all I did was identify the speaker change in the transcript. So I did not go with those functional categories of, you know, what a turn is, but I had to be very kind of strict about saying, whenever there's a speaker change, that's when a new turn is. And no matter what is in that turn, I'm just going to call that a new turn. And then I classified the turns into two categories based on who took the turn, the teacher or the student, counted the number of words in the turn, classified the turn types based on the number of lexical and non-lexical items into three categories: short turns, medium turns, and long turns, and then tracked turn content for their grammatical lexical makeup, and exactly applied another additive multidimensional analysis to it, just to see whether teachers talk differently from the students in the different disciplines. So I'm just going to go through here. Short turn is 1 to 5 items, medium turn is 6 to 99 items, and long turns are 100 items, okay? And here's an example. What I mean by non-lexical item is these ums and these vocalizations that have no lexical content, really. So in the first instance, the first turn that you see here, there are 29 lexical items and 1 non-lexical. In the second turn here, it's all lexical items and 5 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Okay, so let's see then. When I ran this on the T2K plus my case corpus, I found that, you know, 14,000 turns were associated with students and 11,000 turns were teachers. Now, of course, in education, you would have the notion that the more interactive the class is, the better, because the students learn more or learn better. Well, let's look at that a little bit more closely. This would be a pretty good number, because 56% of the students are taking turns, you know, and only 44% of the turns are taken by the teachers. So sounds like pretty interactive classes all across the board. However, when I look at the turn content, it turns out that of the classes that the students take, there are only 3% that are more than 100 words at a time. In other words, whenever the students take a turn, it's very short. It's not even a paragraph length, okay? So 50% of the student turns are actually 1 to 5 words at a time, which is nothing. I mean, if I look at this, it's like the turn 2 had 5 items: hot stove, page 321, question mark. Somebody else can do it. Somebody else can do it. That's the lexical content. So the turns by students are very short, and by teachers are over 100 words, which is not surprising, of course. Okay, so I took the turns that are more than 100 words and included in the analysis. And of course, I went through the same, I'm not going to go through the dimensions again. I applied the same dimensions. So I'm going to run right to the chart to show you that social sciences and business students are very much using language that is contextually driven. And the teachers are incredibly informational all across the board, except for engineering. And we have seen that, right? Yeah, so it's interesting. It's flipped over. The students are more informational, using language that's associated with informational discourse, whereas the teachers are using language which is associated more with contextual directive orientation. So natural sciences, in natural science classes, I have found not one turn that was taken, that was longer than 100 words taken by the students. So students just simply don't talk that much in the natural science classes. That's dimension 1 scores. Dimension 2, again, natural sciences have no student language in them that's longer than 100 words, and engineering classes are very much, in engineering classes, the students and the teacher are on the same page about not using any personalized framing devices at all, or features. Finally, the graduate classes, and actually all across the board on dimension 1, is teachers and students are pretty much using the same type of language, it seems to me, which is also not surprising because we are in a university setting. So there is information involved there, you know, so it's just, we're kind of probably talking differently than in conversation. And then in terms of personalized framing, you know, graduate students are very different from low division student, not very similar to low division students, but somehow something's happening in the upper division. So the students are closer to the teachers, the way they talk. So I think that if I want to have the summary of the findings, this is exactly what I just said now. So I don't need to just kind of repeat what I just said, but it's just an interesting point that you could use the same you know, multidimensional framework to describe the different participants in a dialogue, if you are able to, or if you're interested in interaction and how different participants use language differently. And so you just have to use a different program. So once again, the unit of analysis is different for these studies.